declines in test scores were more than twice as big in the poorest communities in the country than they were in the most affluent. And so that means that kids in those communities are much, much further behind. They already were further behind, and now they're even more behind. So there's sort of a widening inequality as a result of the pandemic, not just an overall decline.
Today, we're discussing the impact of poverty and inequality on educational opportunities, specifically focusing on learning loss during the pandemic and the gains or not that we've made since.
It's kind of crazy that we are still talking about the impacts of the pandemic. And that's the main reason why we're tackling it in several episodes. The data is coming in and it's sobering. The pandemic impacted all learners, no matter the income level, and the recovery has been uneven at best. It's more important than ever to address these gaps and find ways to support all learners. So let's dive in. Welcome to Schools In. I'm Denise Pope, Senior Lecturer with the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford and co-founder of Challenge Success. And I'm with my co-host, Dan Schwartz, who is the Dean of the Graduate School of Education. Hi, Dan.
Well, Dr. Denise, you gotta keep learning, Pope.
That is true. I think particularly in today's world, you gotta keep learning.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And so, unfortunately, the topic of today is learning loss. And I kind of want to make a distinction between two kinds of learning loss that people talk about. So I know you talk about like summer melt learning loss, like explain that just briefly, what that is.
Yeah. And I don't usually say melt, but it works. I like it. It reminds me of ice cream cones in the summer, right? But you know, what happens is when kids, literally some kids have no enrichment at all over the summer. Some of them are having hugely enriching summer lives. They're going to camp, they're going to museums, they're reading books, they're doing a bunch of things. They're working jobs and getting skills that they wouldn't have during the year. But for some kids, they're not. And for whatever kids are doing, you can imagine when you start back in September and you expect them to remember some things in, let's say, math, it has melted out of their brain.
Should I worry about it? Like, I've been out of school for 3 months. I go back, I forgot 3 plus 7. Someone says 3 plus 7 equals 10. I'm back.
It's not always that easy or that fast. And for some kids, I mean, there could be, I think for some kids, there's bigger repercussions than others, which this is why we're doing our show tonight.
Always.
Yeah.
No, I have to describe this study because it's sort of outrageous. So there was someone who took 5-year-olds, English-speaking 5-year-olds, and they had them memorize a passage in Greek from Homer. Yeah.
Oh my God, these poor babies.
Yeah, they just memorized the Greek, just meaningless syllables.
Okay.
And 10 years later, he came back and he had 2 conditions. And in both of them, he tried to teach the same poem.
In Greek.
In Greek. And one condition was these kids who had learned it when they were 5 and probably had no memory that they ever learned it. The other condition were kids who had never been exposed to it. So the ones who had been exposed and memorized it when they were 5 learned it like 5 times faster than the ones who had never been exposed.
Yeah.
What does this have to do with learning loss? You never really lose it. It's just sort of there waiting for you to come back and get it.
I mean, so that gives me a little bit of hope, right?
Yes.
Because I forget things.
I do not want us to give up summer vacation is basically why I'm making this argument.
100%. Okay. But I will tell you, there are some things that I still remember from high school that I have no need for whatsoever. I mean, one that opera when the shure sota, right? Like Chaucer, the first lines of Chaucer. What is that doing in my head? I have all the kings and queens of England memorized in order. Willie, Harry, Steve, Harry, Dick, John, Harry, 3, 1, 2, 3, Ned, Richard, 2, Henry, 4, 5, 6, then who? Why is that in my brain? Somebody, it's like that guy with the Greek. They put that in there and I can't get it out.
I don't know, but just hearing you do that, I like you more. That's why. So here's the other kind of learning loss that I think is a concern.
Okay.
It's when students don't get exposed, like they don't get a chance to learn. So this is the COVID kind of learning loss. So it's different. It's not you learned it and then you stop paying attention for the summer, so you lose some of it. This is you never got a chance to gain that learning. And so we call that learning loss, even though it's just lack of gain. So one of our big questions, right, is what has happened since COVID? And we're incredibly fortunate to have the leading scholar on this topic. It is Professor Sean Reardon. He's a professor of poverty and inequality in education at Stanford. He looks at causes, patterns, trends, consequences of educational inequality across the nation. He has a very unique database that basically has the standardized tests of every child. And so he's been the go-to researcher on pandemic recovery. And so, Sean, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Talk to us.
Yeah.
How do you measure something like loss, right? What is that?
Or rebound, loss and rebound.
Yeah.
We want to know, is everything going back to normal?
Yeah, we have answers to both those questions. First, what we do is we look at, for example, we look at eighth graders in 2019 before the pandemic, and we see across the country and in every school district in the country, what was their average scores in math and reading. And then we're able to look again at eighth graders 3 years later, after the pandemic, spring of 2022, and see what their average scores are in math and reading. And then we can compare where the eighth graders were in 2022. Those kids were in fifth, sixth, seventh grade through the pandemic, and so didn't have the opportunity often to learn all the material that one would typically learn. And we compare them to what the eighth graders 3 years before knew, who went through fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grade under normal conditions. And what we find, and what all the national data shows, is that in 2022, students were about a half grade further behind in math and about a third of a grade further behind in reading than where their counterparts were in 2022. What that means is that over those 3 years of the sort of pandemic period, kids missed out on a half years of instruction of math, essentially. They just didn't get the opportunity to learn as much math as they would have without the pandemic.
So Denise, would that have been your prediction, that of all the disciplines that we measure, math would take the biggest hit?
I think that would have been. A half year is a lot. That's bigger than I would have guessed. A half year, I mean, that's a half a year. I don't, right? That's a lot. I was thinking a couple months maybe, but 6 months. Well, how do you measure a year? Is it 6 months? Because it's a 9-month school year.
It's half of a 9-month school year. So think of it as 4.5 months. It was really a little more than a half, so call it 5 months.
Okay, that's a lot. That's higher than I thought. But yeah, I would have thought math, because that's what empties out of my brain the quickest. So
no, that's not the reason. Sean, do you have a good theory for why math?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason is likely that during the pandemic, when kids weren't getting as much instruction in school, either they weren't in school or they couldn't concentrate as much. There was a lot of obviously else going on in the world. That at home, kids are more likely to read, or if they're young kids, their parents might read to them, right? But it's much less common for kids to sort of sit down and do some algebra in their spare time at home, or have their parents sit down and work through the multiplication tables with them at home. And so most math learning typically happens in school as a result of what happens in math classrooms. But reading, kids learn to read both at school and at home. And so I think that's why we saw a little bit less of a hit in reading than in math, because the missing out on school hurts math more.
And obviously there are other subjects that you learn in school, but you only have data for math and reading. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we for the last 20 years, we have tested in this country every third through eighth grader every year in math and reading. So we have data going back to 2009. So we have about 500 million test scores from every kid in the country over that time period. That tells us a lot about math and reading, but we don't test how well kids are doing in the arts or in history or things like that. And so we don't know as much about what the pandemic did to kids' other sets of skills.
And we may never know, right? Because we don't assess. Well, part of that is what you assess is what you care about too. So that also says something about sort of the lower level status of some of these subjects that don't get assessed. Dan, you don't think that's lower? I'm not saying they do have lower level status.
They're so special that we don't bother to measure them.
Okay, you could look at it that way too, but we still won't know what got lost.
Okay, Sean. So so your database tells me something about the regions the tests are coming from, the social status, the economic status.
Yeah.
Before we talk about the bounce back, like how people are coming back, did the hit to math and English, was it even?
No, that's maybe the biggest concern. I mean, obviously the kids didn't learn as much as a concern, but that fell disproportionately on kids in the lowest income communities in the country. And so the declines in test scores were more than twice as big in the poorest communities in the country than they were in the most affluent. And so that means that kids in those communities are much, much further behind. They already were further behind, and now they're even more behind. So there's sort of a widening inequality as a result of the pandemic, not just an overall decline. And that's particularly concerning.
So one thing, it does, sometimes people bash schools, but when I hear that, I realize how important school is as a lever of equity. And when it gets disrupted, the inequities really, they get bigger, more rampant. Is that a fair conclusion on this? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We often hear that schools are unequal, that schools in poor communities don't have the same resources or don't have the ability to attract as skilled or experienced teachers, or they don't have as good of facilities. And so, schools are worse in poor communities and better in affluent communities. And so people say, oh, the schooling system's really unequal, which there's some truth to that. But schools aren't nearly as unequal as families. Like, the difference in growing up in a poor family and a rich family is, an orders of magnitude of income difference. And the differences between schools and rich and poor communities aren't nearly that big. So while schools might be somewhat unequal, they're much more equal than family environments are in terms of the kinds of resources available. So schools tend to act like an equalizing force in society, even though they're not completely equal. Sort of a interesting paradox.
No, that was really clear. Thank you.
We are going to pause right there for just a minute and be back with the second half of the show. So thanks for sticking with us. Welcome back. This is Schools In with Denise Pope and Dan Schwartz, and we are talking with Sean Reardon all about learning loss during COVID and hopefully get some positives now about the recovery rate. So, Sean, what did you find out when you looked post 2022, I guess that's what it was, at how kids were doing now?
What we found was actually pretty surprising, I think, and better news than I would have expected or many would have expected. What we found was that even though there had been a half grade of sort of lost learning in math, kids recovered a third of that loss in just 1 year, which might not sound like a lot, but what it means is that the average student learned about 15 to 20% more in the 22 to 23 school year than a typical student learned before the pandemic. If we could increase, national productivity or GDP by 20% in a year, we'd be bouncing off the walls, right? So a 20% increase in sort of how much kids learn in 1 year is big. It's also really big in historical terms. If you look back over the last 30 years at sort of the rates at which scores have improved nationally, and they have improved nationally a lot over the last 30 years, the rate at which they improved in this last year was as big or bigger than in any time in the last 30 years. So, the good news is, while there was a big decline, the first year after the pandemic shows real signs of a strong recovery. We're not all the way back, but we made really good progress, and I think a surprising amount.
Is that because people are just pedaling faster? I mean, or...
You mean teachers are working harder? Is that what you mean?
And students.
Yeah.
Do we have some explanation for how this happened?
So I think what likely accounts for it is that school systems and teachers really focused on helping kids kind of catch up with some of the material they lost. And it doesn't, not just kind of in their regular math class, but a lot of school districts invested in extra tutoring programs for kids, after school academic programs for kids, extended summer school programs. So a lot of extra resources went in to try to help kids recover. Some of that was funded by funds from the federal government that were intended to help school districts recover. But in fact, the recovery was much larger than you would have guessed just based on the amount of money that the federal government put in. So I think we owe some gratitude to teachers and principals who, I think really have helped students out a lot post-pandemic, and we've made real progress.
Now, before the break, we were talking about how this was unequal in terms of learning loss, in terms of under-resourced schools. How about the recovery?
The recovery hasn't been unequal. That is, poor kids in poor districts and rich districts have recovered about as much as each other, but that's not enough to undo the inequality that was exacerbated by the pandemic. So kids in low-income districts fell behind further during the pandemic, and then everyone recovered about the same amount during the pandemic. So the kids in the low-income districts are still further behind. In lots of affluent districts, test scores are back up equal to or above where they were before the pandemic. So there's been a near complete recovery in the richest places, but because the poor places saw such a large decline, the recovery hasn't yet been enough to kind of get them back up to where they were before the pandemic.
So my biggest concern on COVID was actually for the youngest kids. That this is an important window for social emotional development, for developing a taste for what schools have to offer. Are they sort of starting to show up in your database? I heard you started with third grade, but are they beginning to show up, and can you get a fix on?
We started with third grade. So far, we haven't seen much difference across grades in how big the lost learning was, and not much difference in the size of the recovery. But those third graders were kids who were sort of coming into kindergarten or just in kindergarten at the beginning of the pandemic. The other group of kids that I worry about are the kids even younger than that, who were sort of in early childhood, in preschool or before, during the pandemic. And we don't know a whole lot about what's happened to those kids. My team and I are starting some research. We're collecting data that's going to help us to answer what happened to those very young kids during the pandemic. But we'll have to come back and talk about that another time.
So they're going to start showing up in your database next year. Is that right?
Yeah, they're starting to come into third grade, and so we'll be able to sort of see more of them over the next few years.
You have a prediction, Denise?
Well, I was just going to say, are you worried because we know there's certain windows where, like even language learning, for instance, right? There's a certain window where it gets much harder as you get older to start something new. Is that why you both are holding this tight with the young kids and worried?
I'm worried about it for a couple of reasons. One is, there's sort of critical periods in early childhood and early elementary school are key periods, but also places that were not in-person schooling for a while, that's particularly hard for a first grader to sort of, first grade Zoom school is not super effective, both at socialization into the sort of how to be in school, and also just in terms of learning. You can't do all the stuff, and you can't have the one-on-one attention from the teacher. So I think it's likely that remote learning sort of was more harmful to the very young kids than it was to the older kids who could adapt more easily to the sort of Zoom modality.
So I'm a parent, I'm listening to this. I want to do something to help, right? This is making me very sad. What can an average person do in terms of helping, advocating? What can we do?
I think one of the things, we looked at survey data, and we found that a lot of parents during and right after the pandemic period didn't really have a sense of how far behind their kids were. Most parents sort of said, I think my kid's doing fine. And the reason why they say that is because imagine that you have an 8th grader in 2022. Well, you don't really know what an 8th grader in 2019 knew in terms of math, unless you happen to have a child 3 years older, right? So it's very hard for a parent to sort of know from their one child, what does a typical 8th grader know and can do in terms of math or other subjects? So it's very hard for a parent to assess whether their kid's on track or behind where they should be. The school district is in a better position, and teachers and the data the district has is a better position to sort of help parents do that. But I don't think there was a lot of communication always of that. And so I think one of the things parents can do is really talk to the teachers and the principals to sort of understand where is their child at and where are kids at in their community, and then think about what resources can they bring, how can they advocate for their child, how can they advocate for other child to make sure that the kids who are behind are really getting the resources they need.
I know there's also you talked about the federal funding, right? ESSR, other funds like that. And I know that they're ending right now. But it sounds like even though you said it wasn't all about money, some of it was about money. So is there a way that an individual can, rally their congressperson, or I don't know, how can we get this money back?
Yeah, the federal government provided school districts with $190 billion over the starting early in the pandemic, and it'll end this year. That sounds like a lot of money, but that actually is only about less than 1/3 of the annual budget we spend on education. So spread out over 4 years or so, it's not a ton of money per child. And that money has mostly been spent, and the rest of it needs to be spent in the next 6 to 9 months. And we're not going to be fully recovered in lots of these districts, particularly the low-income districts, by then. So I think it's important for states to kind of step in and fill the void a little bit, carry the baton, and figure out how to provide extra targeted resources to those kids and those schools and districts that still have a long way to catch up. And parents can really help advocate for that, because they can talk to their state congressperson, they can talk to their superintendent, and they can help keep the pressure on to make sure that people are paying attention to those kids who need it the most.
So Sean, your database, you can separate it by state. There's probably a lot of people who want to know which state's approach to shutting schools work the best, at least for educational outcomes, maybe not for mortality rates. But so do you know this?
Well, we have data actually for every school and school district in the country. And what we generally find, and other research has shown, is that the longer a school district was in a remote or hybrid instruction mode, the further behind kids fell. But really, remote schooling only explains a small part of the learning losses. I mean, you have to remember the pandemic was an all-encompassing global event.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Sean. We learned so much. Thank you for being here. And thank all of you listeners for listening to Schools In with Dan Schwartz and Denise Pope. You can catch all our episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you tune in. All hope isn't lost here, and I think there is a lot we as educators and as parents can do to help. For parents, get involved as much as you can, connect with teachers to see how your kid is doing, offer resources if you have that ability, and ultimately just continue to advocate for your child.
And for educators, keep showing up for the kids like you have been. I know this is a lot of extra work, it's hard work, but it makes a difference. So connect with parents, keep them informed as much as we can, have patience, and help these kids climb back.
100%, Dan. I could not agree more. Thank you again to our guest, Sean Reardon, for this really enlightening conversation. And thank all of you for joining us on this episode of Schools In. Remember to subscribe to our show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in. I'm Denise Pope.
I'm Dan Schwartz.